Hello and welcome back to Watching Brief for the week of the 10th of October 2022. I am joined as ever by my co-host, Mr. Andy Brockman, and I think he's still waiting. He's waiting on Godot. He's waiting on, certainly waiting on something.
I'm waiting on an outbreak of sanity, I think. Or at least I'm waiting on sort of waking up and discovering the famous episode of Dallas where somebody who I think was supposed to be dead or something.
Yeah.
At the beginning of the next series, steps out of the shower, and the whole previous series was actually a dream.
Yes. Yeah.
And I think we're living through that now.
I think we are.
Except it's more of a waking nightmare.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, although I mean, in various ways, we're waiting on things, but I did read today in the Economist that our not so illustrious current Prime Minister has been described as having the shelf life of a lettuce.
No. To be fair, on the Economist, it wasn't that our illustrious Prime Minister has the shelf life of a lettuce. It's that her political authority had the shelf life of a lettuce. In that it's lasted about. It took 5 days from her effectively becoming Prime Minister to her and Kwasi Kwarteng, her Chancellor, crashing the economy.
That's true. That's true. Which is, of course, great for archaeology. It's always great for archaeology. And actually, we'll be touching on that this week because we're going to be doing a bit of an upsum of where we are at following that. What now they do in fact acknowledge was a mini budget. It always was, but they weren't calling that so they could avoid scrutiny. We'll be touching on that and also as well how it relates to where we're at in terms of discussion surrounding the value of archaeology and so on and so forth. Because, for example, as I was saying to you, I think on the phone yesterday, one of like 3 phone calls we had yesterday trying to just think about how to talk about this stuff, was that it's not so much that suddenly there's a potential for action in terms of the value of archaeological work being acknowledged and the and therefore pay and conditions increasing. It's that now you have homeowners and renters in the same place where archaeologists have been for decades. So that's why there's a sudden urgency surrounding this stuff, or not, as we will see. And indeed, as I as much as I am rambling on, our watching brief continues, and it's going to continue this week as a sort of a slight holding pattern following last week, and also just an analysis of where we're at,
But
in comparison to some other NGOs and others. But yes, but what?
But breaking the habit of a lifetime, we're going to start with a really good news archaeology story, because the Swedish paleogeneticist and we've been rehearsing our Swedish pronunciation before we started recording, haven't we?
Don't tell them that.
Anyway, apologies if I've got this wrong, particularly to the recipient, but this year's Nobel Prize for Physiology and Medicine has gone to the Swedish paleogeneticist.
Swedish? You've gone off the rails already, man.
Brain to mouth. The Swedish paleogeneticist Svante Pääbo, who has been doing incredible work on the genomes of early hominids and particularly Neanderthals. And I think we wanted to. I certainly wanted to start with this, and I know we discussed this because it is. Well, first of all, it's the first significant. The first Nobel Prize, in fact, to have any connection with archaeology, since Willard Libby was awarded the Nobel Prize in, I think it was 1961, for his work on carbon-14 or radiocarbon dating. Beg your pardon, 1960. Libby was awarded the Nobel Prize for Chemistry in 1960 for his work on carbon-14 dating, and that underpinned archaeological field work and still does to a large degree. although it's beginning, there are suggestions, as we reported on in Watching Brief a few weeks ago, that
It might be
it's
coming to the
beginning
end
to
of its
become less
usefulness.
effective.
Yeah. Mm.
Yeah,
Mm.
because of atmospheric pollution
Mm.
and so on. I think it's entirely appropriate then that, more than 60 years later, the latest Nobel Prize winner to have a connection with archaeology it's to do with a field that again underpins so much of modern research, genetics.
Mm.
Whether it's medicine or ancient DNA as explored by archaeologists. The other reason I wanted to touch on it really is because I think it is really good to report on a good news story to do with ancient DNA, which is not about a DNA being misused by racists, basically.
Well, yeah, that's
But
true. That's true. Yeah. Yeah.
instead, it's a point that's made beautifully by Becky Ragg-Sykes, who's written a fine book about Neanderthals,
Mm.
in writing in the Guardian, where she is really talking about this work in terms of it's archaeology telling probably the most fundamental story of all, which is where we come from.
Yeah. Incidentally, I have interviewed Rebecca Ragg-Sykes. You can find a link to that below. My favourite quote from here, I think you pointed this quote out to me, so I'm slightly being led by you, Andy. But
So go for it.
it's poetic. She says that the knowledge that the very stuff of Neanderthals is present today in each human heart, thumping with fear or joy, has forged a new emotional connection, not just to them, but to all our other hominin relations. It also underlines the fact that they and we have always been part of a planetary web of life. Beautifully put, and entirely true.
Absolutely, and I think it's terrific that work of that importance that can lead our colleagues to come up with poetry,
Mm-hmm.
almost,
Mm-hmm.
it, like that.
Mm.
That can come out of
It
the work of
it
archaeologists,
it
and
almost deserves a prize of some sort, doesn't it?
the Nobel Prize for Literature. But no, I mean, Rebecca Ragg-Sykes' book
Yeah,
Kindred has won a number of prizes
yeah,
for in the archaeological sector, and deservedly so.
yeah.
Um,
Well,
but
and in that sense, it's as she just did there. What she's doing is she's restoring Neanderthals to us as fellow humans, but also in many ways restoring, I suppose ourselves to them. Trying to just break down some of that popular Darwinian differential that's been built up over many years.
I think that's the beauty of it. And again, I mean, one of the great movements in archaeology, certainly in my lifetime, has been the massive expansion of our knowledge and the work and the techniques that can be applied to prehistory, and particularly even early prehistory,
Mm-hmm.
from the earliest hominids in the Homo sapiens family tree.
Mm.
And I think it is like being put back in touch. It's like one of those "Who do you think you are?" Sort of type documentaries. It's putting us all back in touch with the extended family,
Yeah,
and I think that's a wonderful thing.
yeah. Well, there you go. Never let it be said that we don't report on archaeology occasionally on this show. Of course, we do all the time, but at the moment we are, as I said last week, and as I'm repeating this week, we are somewhat aware of and rightly distracted by. I think. I think, as you said it, the legal basis for archaeology potentially being on fire. Like within the legal basis of archaeology,
Not wanting to exaggerate or anything, it's just
legal basis of archaeology certainly within, as I understand it, England and Wales being on fire
yes.
as it stands. So we figured it might be worthwhile just doing a little overview of where we're at, how we are relating to other interest groups. By we, I mean archaeologists and the heritage sector, and and also maybe just touching a little bit on what has happened and what might happen next. I guess it's important to be aware of this, if nothing else, so that you can possibly slot in your expertise at home, and your awareness and your ability to reach out, for example, to your MP or to others, while stuff is up in the air, shall we say? Stuff is up in the air. So it all began, and we already kind of know this. So I'll ask Andy to be relatively brief in the opening elements of this timeline. But it all began with an announcement from a new Chancellor of the Exchequer, and that, for our international audience, is the senior government minister who is involved in running our economy. So he or she sets the budget and makes pronouncements and announcements on what we can and can't afford in this country.
And our sector can't avoid the blame entirely for Kwasi Kwarteng, because by training he's actually a classicist and has a PhD in economic history.
But so do so many of them. I mean, like Johnson was a classicist, for crying out loud. You know. Yes. Sorry, go on.
Yeah. No,
So, following on from last week's worst case scenario, scenario surrounding the Dorman Long Tower and Teesside, a little case study, a taster as to what is already possible in terms of sidetracking and obfuscating and avoiding the rules that exist to protect the natural environment, the historical environment, and also rules surrounding lobbying and interest groups and so on and so forth, and access and decision making, and etc. etc. We now are in a situation where we've had a mini budget presented to the nation, which, as we've hinted at in previous episodes, may have very big implications for precisely that kind of scenario that we looked at last week. And if you haven't seen that video, please do, or listen to that podcast, please do listen to it, unfolding ever more frequently. And indeed, potentially also in the context of archaeologists simply not being able to do archaeology, not because they don't want to, not because archaeology isn't a thing, but because archaeology may become just utterly, completely unaffordable. Some of the stuff that was released in what has now been acknowledged as a mini budget. At the time, they were just calling it an announcement or a presentation, because the top team at number 10 and number 11 were trying to avoid too much scrutiny from the Office of Budget Responsibility, for example. It landed, it's fair to say. It landed at the end of September, and we're still feeling the repercussions today, aren't we?
I think land is the wrong word. Belly flopped, I think, is probably more appropriate.
Yeah.
Look, very, very quick bit of background. Okay.
Yeah.
At the beginning of September, what seemed like endless Conservative Party leadership campaign came to an end, and Elizabeth Truss replaced Boris Johnson. Effectively on the Tuesday she won, and they rocked up to Balmoral to exchange the prime ministership. Effectively, Boris Johnson gave up the prime ministership and Liz Truss took it on. They had an interview with the Queen. On the Thursday, the Queen died, and where Liz Truss was clearly expecting to hit the ground running, as the phrase was going to be, with what they were calling Operation Rolling Thunder, which was going to be a series of really important announcements about the economy and taxation and things that would be to show that the government was, her government was taking over and was in business and was going to deliver, as her favourite phrase is. Basically, everything went on hold for 2 weeks during the mourning period and running up to the funeral.
Yeah.
On the Friday after the Queen's funeral, when the country had appeared to come together in a sort of, in the recognition that even if you weren't a monarchist, it was a major historic moment and a moment for thinking about where the country's going to go. The following Friday, Kwasi Kwarteng, the Chancellor, who's very much an ideological soulmate, at least, of Liz Truss, to the extent that they're seen very much as a duo, he stood up as Chancellor of the Exchequer and delivered a speech to the House of Commons, which had been much trailed, but announcing, most importantly, a massive support package for energy costs for both individual households and for businesses. There are different terms, but everyone recognizes that doing something about the rising cost of energy was absolutely critical to stop the economy falling apart.
Yeah.
But on top of this, the sort of the what turned out to be this sort of deep brown icing on top of the cake were a series of unfunded tax cuts which appeared to advantage the richest in society, including the rabbit out of the hat, the untrailed item that's designed to take the journalist by surprise, and everyone goes, "Wow, there's a rabbit come out of the hat! Wow, brilliant,
Ooh.
Chancellor." It was actually a cut in the 45p rate of income tax to 40p for the highest earners.
Yeah.
Which basically means the more you earn, the more you save. A think tank called the Resolution Foundation did some number crunching after the budget. And whereas low-income households would probably save around £22 a year on after the Chancellor's mini budgetary event, or whatever we're going to call it, the richest households will gain on average over £9,000.
Right. Okay.
Now, and your response there shows roughly how that would have landed and how it landed among particularly people on lower pay, and of course, people on lower pay includes a lot of archaeologists.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now, the fact that this was all these cuts were all unfunded, which meant that the government didn't publish figures to show where the money was going to come from to account for the money that they were not going to take in income tax anymore. They deliberately avoided that kind of scrutiny. And the financial markets took this extremely badly. The pound tanked. Then following up a rather obscure area of the financial markets, but it's very important for people's pensions, private pensions, called the gilts market, also got into trouble. To the extent that the Bank of England had to intervene to buy up government gilt. So basically, it's state money buying state debt to make sure that pension funds don't go belly up, and lots of people, all of whom have votes, suddenly find that most of their income's disappeared.
Yeah. So, I mean, what you've just described there. I mean, before we even get to the environmental stuff, has basically laid and is still today, I think, as you hinted, is still unfolding as a potential base of sand now that they've introduced underneath the economy, in so much as the Bank of England won't continue to buy that stuff, and unless it becomes more trustworthy, stable. Then things aren't looking good.
Basically, the government has this incredibly ambitious program, which it announced to coincide with Kwarteng's speech. It published what it called a growth plan, which sounds great. Nobody in their right mind is going to say that we shouldn't grow the economy, but the question is how you grow the economy.
Yeah.
And I know there are some people on in the green movement, for example. I've been talking to some this week. So traditional growth is just not ethical anymore. We've got to grow. We can only, we're facing a climate emergency, and everything has to be predicated on that.
Now we mentioned the government growth plan in Watching Brief a couple of weeks ago.
That's right, straight after the event. Yeah.
For more on that, do check out that episode as well. But in that sense, then, okay, so the economy isn't looking great. That tends to be quite bad for building. That tends to be quite bad for archaeology, broadly speaking. But we're not quite sure how that's going to pan out just yet. No. But what we do know is that during that budget, there was also an announcement of something called investment zones, and this was a repackaged version of what were they called under Johnson's government?
Freeports,
and
they've had other names since the 1980s.
Yeah. And these are areas where environmental protections would be reduced, planning regulations would be so-called liberated, tax would be lower for certain types of business, and generally speaking, on the one hand, you can see where they're coming from, especially if you're of a certain ideology. For anyone who's interested, look up a book called, or a pamphlet. I think people call it a pamphlet. It's not a very big book, called Britannia Unchained, co-authored by our current Prime Minister and Chancellor and some others.
Well, Priti Patel and Dominic Raab, other names to conjure with from the previous Johnson administration.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
and a former universities minister.
Oh, okay, interesting. But what all of that apparently is designed to do is to grow the economy so fast that actually we don't notice that we're missing out on tax revenue because there's just so much money floating around, and it'll trickle down and we'll all be happy. And well, I don't know, I'm not sure if happiness really comes into it. But certainly the quality of the environment comes into it, and it was on the day of the mini budget that NGOs with an interest in the health of the environment really came out off the starting gate with a crack, didn't they?
That's right. And if you look back through their social media feeds, for example, organisations like the National Trust, the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds, in particular, also the wildlife trusts, which is an alliance of different regional wildlife trusts across the country who look after things like local nature reserves and so on, all came together along with an organisation called Countryside Link, which again has a lot of membership, the membership of a large number of often the smaller NGOs, including actually the Council of British Archaeology. All of them have been quick out of the traps to say that what was published in the government's growth plan is highly dangerous. And in fact, they've been promoting a hashtag called Attack on Nature. Now, this has had a lot of traction in the media.
Yep.
For example, last Sunday, both the Sunday Times and the Observer, two of the leading Sunday broadsheets, had front page second story. First story was Ukraine and the Kerch Bridge. Second story was the attack on nature and the response of the RSPB, National Trust, etc. The stories that have been coming out of Whitehall prompted that have been briefed to political journalists, for example. One of them uses the suggestion that members of the government and Conservative MPs have been, quotes, spooked by the response and the vociferous, in your face, front foot nature of the response to the growth plan. There have been stories, for example, of rapidly called crisis meetings in departments like DEFRA, the Department of the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, as to how they're going to deal with this. Because you're dealing with organisations that have a mass membership totaling over 6 million.
Yeah.
Paid up members. That is vastly bigger than any political party. And certainly the Conservative Party.
Yeah.
So the consensus, certainly among the commentariat at the moment, seems to be that the response of the NGOs has been extremely effective in that it's certainly caught the government's attention.
Well, and they appear. So, I mean, you talked about last weekend. The weekend before that, they had stuff in the Sunday papers as well. They've clearly had a strategy. For example, on 10 hours ago, it was announced, according to the BBC, that 3 UK conservation groups have said that all options are on the table as they challenge what they describe as a government U-turn on protecting nature. The National Trust, the RSPCB. That's a computer thing. RSPB and the Wildlife Trust have said that they could urge millions of members to take to the streets in demonstrations. The group leaders said new government policy was an attack on nature. So again, clear messaging. Hashtag attack on nature. It's in the article. It's in the along with that, it's also in the newspapers. For example, on this was 2 days ago. Never mind 10 hours ago. 2 days ago, on the 10th of October, full page ad in the Telegraph from 12 nature NGOs saying that, Dear Prime Minister, no one can afford for nature to be under attack. A little bit of what they say in that full page article, the full page advert rather. Pitting growth against nature is a false choice. Our economy, food, security, and health depend on a thriving natural environment. Your government, small g, elected on a manifesto pledge to have the most ambitious environmental program of any country on earth, crikey, end quotes, is proposing to remove vital environmental protections. This risks catastrophic consequences for nature, people, and the economy. And it should be said that the Telegraph is people often call it the Tory graph, don't they? Because it's basically the preferred newspaper of this government, and it certainly supports them for the most part.
Yeah, I mean, look, that and just the very existence of that full page ad that they've chosen to spend a lot of money, because a broadsheet full page ad is quite expensive. They very carefully placed it in that paper. They didn't put it in the Guardian.
No,
that's the converted.
Yeah.
They put it in the Telegraph, which is read by traditionally by Conservative Party members and particularly by Conservative Party MPs. That's the paper. That's the paper that's been leading with the Mail in the war on woke. It's the paper that has given a platform to the entryists from Restore Trust, who are trying to take over places on the National Trust Council. They're actually they appear to be being directed by one of the right of centre think tanks that's been supporting Liz Truss. Certainly, people who are involved with it are connected with several of the right of centre think tanks. So to have that crop up in that advert crop up in the Telegraph, that they were talking directly to Conservative backbenchers. Backbenchers who are worried about their jobs come the next election. I'll come on to that in a minute, maybe, if I may.
Well, it's interesting. Could I just say one more thing about this?
Go ahead, yeah.
Well, that is that it's effective messaging. So on the one hand, it says, you said this, and you're doing that. So it's holding them to account. It has all of the organizations' logos at the bottom. Organizations that aren't necessarily competitors, but certainly have individual niche interests. For example, National Trust is there, Greenpeace is there, RSPB is there, the WWF is there, and so on and so forth, and also the Wildlife Trust and so on, etc. So they're all there. They've come together because the actual context of their work is under threat. Never mind their individual causes and their individual, seasonal. For example, the National Trust this autumn is doing a wonderful job actually of saying, look what beautiful nature is. The red carpet is being rolled out for you. They have posters with red leaves on. They've put that aside and they've joined this campaign. They end with two links. One of them is a short link, a bit.ly link, bit.ly link. Another one is peoplesplanfornature.org. So there's not a complex. There's not like a complex sort of call to action. It's just a case of this is what's happening. If you're interested, these are the organisations that are warning you of this, and this is where you need to go next. And as they say, or as people often say, they parked a tank on the lawn of the government. They've literally just gone in and gone, no, this is ridiculous. You can't do that. And as you say, it's spooked them.
Yes, I think that's undoubtedly the case. What's really interesting about all this is I think if you step back and just look at it in terms of the politics and practice of the environmental sector, and I'm including that in its wider sense, including the heritage environment. Obviously, the National Trust is a heritage body as well as being an environmental body, because as well as having large amounts of landscape under its remit, it also has, most famously, a lot of historic buildings and historic buildings that sit in those sensitive, environmentally sensitive historic landscapes, and areas of outstanding natural beauty and national parks and all the rest of it. And as you know, I'm always saying there is no heritage environment or natural environment. It's one thing, it's the environment. What's absent from this discussion, though, and that's been picked up by people commentating on archaeological Twitter and so on, is where is the voice of archaeology in this?
And when you say the voice of archaeology, do you mean fame?
What's that in a minute? Where is the broader voice of archaeology? Where is the where is the heritage sector?
Yeah.
When the BBC comes and does an upsum report like the one that we've been quoting from, which quotes the head of the National Trust and the head of the RSPB and the head of the Wildlife Trust and so on, where is the head of the CBA? Where's the head of CIFA? Why some people have been asking, are the voices all so separate? Why does the sector not have a single voice in this? Why are these organisations not working together to come up with a joint position?
And indeed, a question that we've raised in the past, for example, last year when there was questions around university department closures, if there are gaps in that voice or in these voices, why are other voices not welcome as well? I just thought I'd just throw that in there. But if no one individually wants to comment on a particular element, why aren't other voices welcome? Yeah. I mean, I'm looking at the picture on the BBC article. There's lots of foliage. So, I mean, Neil Redfern might be back there behind a leaf or something. It's hard to tell.
Yeah. Well, look,
so
okay.
I'm being a bit cruel.
You're being a bit. Look, I'm not going to pick out this. We mustn't pick on the CBA in particular. As you said, Federation of Archaeology Managers and Employers, FAME, describes itself as the voice of archaeology. It's the representative body for contracting archaeological units and consultancies. I checked just before we started recording, and I couldn't find a single mention of this issue on either their website or their Twitter feed.
No.
And yet, if the government gets its way and deregulates and, quote, liberalises planning and compresses the timescales and eliminates, quote, red tape, it's potentially FAME's members which will be most affected.
Certainly economically.
They are the ones that potentially will lose the work that pays their staff.
Yeah.
So why, oh why, are they silent?
A watching brief is a formal programme of observation and investigation to record and report on notable discoveries on an archaeological site. As part of our ongoing watching brief, Andy and I work hard to bring you the best, the worst, and sometimes the more quirky happenings from the world of archaeology. We aim to provide a space where voices can be heard, opinions shared, and sometimes truth spoken to power. If you believe in the work we do, please consider supporting us on Patreon for as little as $1 per month. Thank you. Would you? I can't help but ask then. And I know I've asked something very similar in the past, but what is a voice of professional anything if it doesn't comment on existential threats to the profession that it claims to be the voice of? Like I know I'm asking, that's more of an opinion that I'm asking of you there, but I'm exasperated. I'm increasingly frustrated because this isn't the first case study along these sorts of lines, or the first opportunity along these sorts of lines that we've seen our leadership structure, PR structure, however you want to frame it, be behind the curve. We saw it on Ukraine earlier this year. We've seen it in recent years on matters of plurality and voices surrounding, for example, protection of university departments and departments being under threat from essentially a hostile government policy guised as free speech. Okay, rather than asking you to answer that, because I don't want you to put you in an uncomfortable, situation. In so much as I think quite rightly you're trying to comment on what has been done and what we know, as opposed to speculating. What has been done? What have we seen from relevant bodies in the heritage world?
Well, I think what we've seen from the heritage world is summed up pretty well in a press release that was put out, a blog post rather, that was put out and tweeted out by the CBA a few days ago.
Okay.
We'll link to it again below the line.
So this is on the 6th of October, yeah?
That's right. Yes,
Yeah,
yes,
okay.
yes, and it appears on the CBA website. It's not prominent on the CBA website, but they did tweet it out on their
So
social
it's
media feeds.
homepage, news resources, search our resources, and then you find it. Okay, so it's not quite on the same level as a full page ad in a national broadsheet.
Telegraph.
Yeah. Okay.
No. And I think that the key to understanding the approach of the heritage NGOs and representative bodies is a paragraph where the post says, quote, "As such, the CBA's current role is one of gaining understanding. We are working with our advocacy partners to understand the true implications of these plans," meaning the government's growth plan, investment zones and so on, "for our historic environment." And then it lists the partners: Chartered Institute for Archaeologists, Association of Local Government Archaeology Officers, the Archaeology Forum, the Federation of Archaeology Managers and Employers. You haven't mentioned it.
Yep.
I'm gonna live forever. The joint community.
Sorry, go on. So I was going to go off on a whole tangent about fame. Go on.
The Joint Committee of National Amenity
Leg
Societies,
warmers.
the Heritage Alliance, the National Trust, Countryside and Wildlife Link, and the Council for Protection of Rural England.
Yeah.
To name a few. Now, you can see that's a pretty broad cross-section of the bodies in the sector, some of which have been very prominent, like the National Trust, and like the Countryside and Wildlife Link, which have put out a quite outspoken press release on behalf of their members. Far more outspoken than anything that the CBA has put out. The CBA is a member of the Countryside and Wildlife Link. There's a sort of disjoint. I think traditionally archaeological bodies have taken the view that they don't have the resources, and in fact CBA is quite plain about this in the blog post. It says we fully support the current campaigns, a hashtag attack on nature and hashtag people's plan for nature. That's being put forward by the RSPB and the National Trust. National Trust in particular is pushing the People's Plan for Nature, which is the idea that there's a popular voice and ownership for legislation for the rules in the environmental area. And it says we will continue to take part in conversations to share understanding, thinking, and resources, and make sure our collective voice is heard. But then it says this collaborative approach is a key part of our advocacy work and helps us make the most of our limited resources. And I think that's the thing. The archaeology sector sees itself as having few resources when in fact it still has thousands of people who are active archaeologists and tens of thousands more who enjoy history and archaeology and maybe share memberships with the CBA and the National Trust and other bodies, and certainly support and enjoy the work and visit archaeological sites when they're open and take part in the festival and things like that. So there's a sort of a lack of ambition, and then it says again, buried in the paragraph, it is not as a separate thing, not highlighted. Everyone can help in this essential work by contacting their own MPs and the government to set out their concerns and call for continued support of wider environmental protection.
And they link to their toolkit as well further down the page for doing that.
Which is at the bottom of the page, it's not hot linked in that paragraph.
No.
You can't just think, oh, that's a great idea. Click, go off and write your letter, send it in your email to your MP. It's almost, there's that awful phrase about, taking a butter knife to a gunfight. But you can't help but, you know, okay, they may be doing their best, but their mindset is of as I think still a lobbying group rather than a campaigning group.
Hmm.
I think I think you can build a case that the archaeology sector over the years has tried to move things from the inside rather than trying to mobilize on the outside,
Hmm.
which is the opposite to certainly what the RSPB and the National Trust are doing at the moment. Yeah, just this morning I was looking at again coverage, which is saying that, for example, the head of Hilary McGrady, head of the National Trust, and others have tried to talk to the Environment Secretary, and they haven't had any they haven't been given any direct contact, which they find really unusual.
Hmm. Hmm.
Yeah, and to me, that is a sign of political panic. They're battening down the hatches, trying to work out what the chuff to do back in Whitehall.
So,
And yeah, come
I'm going to bring a little bit of a conversation that we had yesterday in at this point, just a little bit,
on.
because we do. Yesterday we were talking somewhat about cost of living crisis, and you
Yeah.
know, I sort of said actually what's happened is that society is now caught up with where archaeologists have been for a while.
Mm,
But if what we're seeing is a small voice,
mm,
you know, on the tailcoats of a larger campaign, a hashtag campaign put together
mm,
by explicitly natural environment groups with large memberships.
mm,
Is the best case scenario that archaeology kind of stumbles through this like a, you know, sort of limps basically through a gate or a hole in policy that's been opened up by this campaign, but keeps on being attacked by a government on cultural grounds, and doesn't continues to feel that it doesn't really have the strength to, for example, insist that archaeologists are paid more, or that the work we do is actually valuable, or indeed legally mandated, underscore, at this point, at least, and that we find ourselves back here again in a year's time, in 6 months' time. This is a perennial, indeed more
mm,
than perennial issue for archaeology. The question of how we relate to power, and how we seem to think, on the one hand, we shouldn't rock the boat, but then on the other hand, actually we don't really have a loud enough voice to rock the boat anyway. So we're just going to
yeah.
keep on saying, you know, nice things and not annoy anyone, and but also as well keep on bringing in those students. You
Mm,
know, what I mean, again, something else I said to you yesterday was I very much feel as though my academic generation in
mm,
archaeology, an awful lot of people since as well, are in a situation where we've basically been let down, in so much as there aren't career paths, there aren't ways of actually retaining people. And if if this is the best that the sector can do, and isn't going to push harder on these matters, what can we expect for the future of archaeology? I mean, we'll link below to a report that Ken Aitchison, head of FAME, put out on his Twitter account in recent days. It's a good start, I suppose. He's acknowledging that, you know, that there's a careers issue in archaeology.
mm.
I
It's a
pointed
really
out
important piece.
it's an important piece, but I pointed out he's late to the party. Yeah, and we know that, and that's the question.
Mm.
That's my question. And question mark, massive question mark.
Right. I'm not going to look that far ahead because I think there are immediate issues that are going to colour what happens next.
Yeah. Okay.
One is that I think it's absolutely right to suggest that the problems that archaeology has had with wages and retention, bad morale, people feeling exploited, people feeling they had no career path. The
Well,
kind of things.
sorry. Can I just say that the very fact that it's a grim joke that that graduate professional archaeologists and people who are qualified in a variety of ways, not just graduates, say, "Oh well, I'm always going to be poor. I'm never going to be able to own a house." It's an it makes me angry for my colleagues as much as for myself. It's
Yeah.
sorry. Go on.
No,
Go
no.
on.
I mean, look, no. You're right to
It's
point
not
out those
funny.
things.
It's just not funny.
No,
But
no.
yeah.
You're right to point out those things. You're right to point out. And we've discussed the Badger report a few weeks ago
Mm-hmm.
about poverty in archaeology. Kenneth Acheson's piece acknowledging that there are problems with lack of career structures and retention and so on. It's important that somebody with his position as the head of FAME is saying that is that is a problem. That, I mean, he says, for example, and I think it's a quite astonishing quotation. It should be blazoned on every archaeologist's mind. It is. He says that other industries recognise perhaps value archaeology degrees more than we do. It's an astonishing admission. So and hopefully it betokens it's the first baby step on the way to trying to do something about it. We talked before, though, when we discussed the Badger report, about the difficulties around that, and I won't rehearse those arguments again.
No.
I think what's changed. We're in a very dynamic political situation at the moment. And almost a bigger problem than the tanking pound and the fact that that pension funds might be about to go belly up because of government issues with government guilt and things like that, is the pressure on interest rates. Because although we're seeing, again, it's to be applauded, a number of units, AOC, Wessex, others, Cotswold Archaeology, have made ex gratia quotes cost of living payments of up to £1,000 for their staff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But those aren't regular pay rises, permanent pay rises. It's a one-off, and unlike the government, they have to fund it from somewhere. Again, the question, they've obviously taken the decision that they need to and they can, and that's, again, as I say, it's to be applauded, but it's probably not sustainable.
No.
And the issue at the moment with interest rates is that the Bank of England is using interest rates to try and cool down inflation as a way of bringing the government's fiscal discipline back into play. Basically, the idea if there's too much inflation, everything gets too expensive, and then you get wage inflation, and it's a circle of horror in the economy. But when you have people on incomes that aren't rising by much, when their shopping's going up 10-15% already, and then their mortgage goes up, or their buy-to-let landlord, their mortgage goes up, so they pass the rent on to the group of young archaeologists straight out of university working on a contracting unit on their first digging job, who are in a flat and are suddenly paying X more a month because of their employer's mortgage. Their landlord's mortgage. These things are all coming together at the beginning of winter, and which is why the winter fuel issue was so live, and why the government has tried to deal with it by throwing a lot of money at it. The problem is, as a number of economic forecasters and journalists have pointed out, they've thrown a lot of money at winter fuel. So the prices that they're paying aren't as hiked as they would have been otherwise. But they haven't got any money left in the kitty to sort out the mortgages.
No.
And the rents.
No. I mean, as you can tell, this upsets me, and it's not out of. I mean, obviously, I think we're all, they reckon that at least. Well, frankly, almost everyone in the country is going to be affected by all these problems that are on,
or already are,
that are unfolding. Exactly, yeah. But as I hinted at earlier, none of this is new for archaeologists. Affordability is not new. And I'm just a bit fed up of people sort of going, I don't know how we got here. How did we get here? So either that, or on the other hand, either jaded people saying, what, you actually expect to be able to earn a living? kind of thing, as though that's a decent response. And I saw that response from working archaeologists not that long ago in the field. We were having a conversation with one of them. Or turning it into a club. We all suffer together. That's what makes us archaeologists. Career in ruins, that kind of thing. Salt of the earth. I'm a real archaeologist. I can't afford beans.
Yeah, the archaeologist in the hair shirt instead of the Hy-Vee.
Yeah. And the thing is,
or the hair shirt under the Hy-Vee.
And the thing, I'm from a Liverpool, Irish, Welsh background. I get dark humour. I get dry humour. But I just find myself exasperated and disappointed and really concerned that I may end up losing, in the life sense, losing colleagues and friends because they can't square this circle. And for some people in our sector, for some very senior people in our sector, it's just the way it is. It's just and I just keep on coming back to that great big question mark. Yeah, and do something.
Okay.
And so I don't know if this is helpful in terms of my, but I'm just being honest here. I'm very, very frustrated.
Okay. First of all, taking the long view, in some respects, though it perhaps wasn't as red in tooth and claw as currently, but some commentators have said that have seen the origins of the current pressure on the government to, for example, bear down on inflation and by making spending cuts and so on, which again Liz Truss denied she was going to do in Parliament today at PMQs, and then her spokesperson was apparently rowing back on that in briefing journalists afterwards. I think most people think that there are going to be very substantial cuts in public spending, falling probably on non-protected departments, which basically means education, culture, possibly transport. For example, there are rumours that if defence will cut, particularly in the current situation regarding Ukraine, there are rumours that the Defence Secretary has said he'll walk.
Yes.
So, and Truss probably wouldn't survive something like that.
No.
So, we're in for a very bumpy ride, but it's the same kind of bumpy ride, probably, or perhaps more so than we saw in 2010, 2011, when I first got involved in this kind of research and work and commentary, because Cameron and Osborne, then and then another Chancellor Prime Minister duo, Prime Minister Cameron, Chancellor Osborne, came in with and said that they were going to balance the books and introduce the what was then called austerity. At that point, historic England, English Heritage then lost a third of its budget in a couple of years.
Yeah.
The CBA lost all its subsidy. It used to be a much better resourced organisation than it is now, because it used to get central subsidy from central government or arm's length bodies. That all went in 2010, 2011 under the Cameron coalition. So it's in a sense we have been here before and we lived through it, and maybe archaeology, I think, does have a way of trying to bimble on through. If there's a fault, if there's a problem in the sector, I think it spends a lot of time looking inwards at itself and thinking that everybody else plays by the rules that it plays by and has the priorities that it has, and it sorts everything out, by having meetings with everybody that they can't tell you about because it's too secret and too sensitive.
Incidentally, I think, is there any way to quantify how many meetings those groups have?
Watch this space.
Yeah.
But what we're seeing, in stark contrast now, because it is affecting these groups so directly, the hashtag attack on nature is such a direct, apparent threat to the natural environment, that the big NGOs, National Trust, RSPB, wildlife trusts, who are professional campaigners, have taken the lead and are and thank goodness they have, because otherwise we'd be nowhere in this.
Yeah. I think that's a positive.
Look, go on the CBA website, look at their press release, go through to their toolkit, write to your MP if you feel you want to. But at the same time, I think we have to say, if you want to be proactive about it, more proactive about it than just writing to your MP, for example. If support what the natural environment NGOs are doing too. As I said, it's one environment in the end. And I suspect that if it comes to a major demonstration in central London that's called by the National Trust and the RSPB and so on, there'll be a lot of archaeologists in there marching too, regardless of whether it's been endorsed by the CBA and C from Fame or not.
Yeah. Okay. I guess we'll leave it there. We'll see what happens next, and
it's a very dynamic situation. We don't know what's going to happen next. The way things are going, Elizabeth Truss could be no longer Prime Minister in a few weeks' time, certainly by Christmas.
And that's true. But I think regardless of what happens, I guess that's the point. That's the reason why I'm so angry. Actually, is the sector has allowed itself to be in a situation where it absolutely is reliant on everyone else but itself. Economically, it's reliant on so many things. In terms of careers prospects, it's reliant on just using up the youth and burning through them. In terms of preserving expertise, we've talked about that in the past, how actually there's not much in the way of passed down for individual expert knowledge because there's no structure for it. In terms of campaigning and lobbying, as far as we can tell, at the moment it looks as though if we do get through this, it's going to be on the back of other people's work, other groups' work. And that may well be, as you say, because the CBA has had its budget slashed. Fair enough. And I should be clear, I don't think of these people as bad guys. I don't think of them as people who are, who I want to replace or I could do a better job. I think of them as people who are not remotely reassuring, for the most part, in terms of the perception of their action. And their intent, and the fact that old tactics don't work anymore, particularly with this government. They don't care if you're nice to them. They don't care if you don't rock the boat. You're useful to the extent that you might be able to provide them with a good headline or a distracting headline in tomorrow's newspaper. That's about it. So if you're pro-growth, brilliant, we'll use you. If you're talking about culture and heritage and history and maybe the slave trade, we'll abuse you. I hate the fact, and that's the word I do. I hate the fact I am angry, I am frustrated, I am concerned to the greatest extent that we're in a situation where we have very little wriggle room as a sector. And I know that you've in the past you've talked about how it's not great to be, for example, reaching out and hoping that people pay attention to the fact that we're not actually in your way, as some campaigns have done. We're not red tape. It's not selling yourself. It's not confidence. Yeah. And I suppose the question is where is that confidence going to come from? Not least because at the moment, and I'll repeat it, archaeology is a mandated part of the planning process. And if we're not careful, that process is going to go away. Certainly, and I don't want to go into this, but I'll just say it. Certainly, it's going to go away if we're more concerned about a niche film about a king dug up in a car park that probably won't even make a scratch on the international box office. I just don't know what we're up to as a profession.
I haven't seen the film yet. I'm not going to comment.
I haven't seen the film yet, and yet an awful lot of people have commented. Like it,
I know.
But anyway, folks at home, I'm not going to go away and drink a bottle of whiskey. Like, not least because
why not? It's a nice thing to do. It's long winter evenings. It's sort of sit in front of the fire with it, or sit in front of the sort of the twigs that are burning in the hearth because you can't afford anything else. With a nice single malt.
Not least because I can't afford to.
I've still got some left over from Christmas.
No, to be fair, no, we have got half a bottle. I'm not there, but I'm kind of getting fed up of all we can do is talk about what other people are doing and not what our friends and colleagues and people who we desperately want to work with, and people who we desperately want to see doing well, talking about what they're not doing. Anyway, hopefully next week we'll have something else to talk about, or some new development, or maybe something else along the lines of that wonderful Neanderthal story. But that in itself was chemistry, wasn't it? It's yeah. I'm sorry. Did you have any final words? I'm going to stop rambling on now.
No, I don't. Apart from the fact that that we're in a very dynamic political situation, where underlying social issues, financial issues, career issues in archaeology have come together with a destabilized wider world of work and whatever. I think nobody can really predict where things are going to end up. It's one heck of a mess. There's all that. For example, again, just before we started recording, I was looking at rumours that are doing around in Westminster. Apparently, that pretty much that entire budget, with the exception of the mini budget, with the exception of the cost of living energy support, is going to go. They're going to have to U-turn on it because it just cannot be sustained in the current political climate, with the criticisms coming in from the Office of Budget Responsibility, the International Monetary Fund, and so on. But the Truss and Kwarteng have basically burned through any what's called political capital they have, and more so. This is probably the weakest, but yet most consequential government we've had in decades, if not ever, in the modern world.
So, are you saying that perhaps what the National Trust and OSPB and others have been campaigning about may actually be thrown out?
One of the if that does happen, and I'm not saying it's going to happen, and Liz Truss is supposed to be pretty driven and pretty stubborn. But if it comes down to political survival, anything can happen. You can do U-turns on U-turns, in the hope of gaining another few days, and that something will turn up. But if that growth plan does have to be put back on the shelf, in the name of political survival and stabilising the economy, one of the reasons that will have happened is because of the campaigning that RSPB, National Trust, and all those other NGOs have done. Because it's one of the things that has spooked Conservative MPs, particularly backbenchers, particularly MPs who maybe want to have a seat after the next general election. Because at the moment, with the Labour Party on an average of a 20% roughly lead, some up to 33%, the Conservative Party is looking at a near wipeout in electoral terms.
Yeah,
and that will put them out of power for probably at least a decade.
So if that potential, I'm not talking about the election result, but if the economic plan being U-turned does occur and all of that threat suddenly goes away, we shouldn't make the mistake of thinking it's because we sat on our hands and waited.
Absolutely not.
No.
It will have been because of those front page stories on the the Sunday Times and the Observer, the full page ad in the Telegraph, and the reported 100,000 plus emails from members of the National Trust and the RSPB and so on to MPs, and more coming in all the time.
Well, and also presumably members of the CBA as well.
Indeed, yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
Okay,
not to discount that.
No. Okay, cool, grand. Well, folks, as I say, we can't promise exactly what we'll be talking about next week, but hopefully I'll be a little less irritated. Thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. Please do comment below. Please do watch last week's episode. It maybe because it was about what looked like a niche thing in Teesside. It didn't quite get the views that we were hoping it would. But definitely go back and take a look, because it lays out what happens when the existing protections are circumvented, and indeed it lays out what could become a very common scenario in the event that protections are fully repealed in the UK. So do check it out if you're interested. I guess that's it. Thank you for watching. Until next time, do take care. Thank you, Andy. Bye bye.
Bye bye.